Hello, welcome to Chapter 6, Cultural Values, Roadmaps for Behavior. In Chapter 6, we talk about cultural patterns. Cultural patterns help us to make generalizations about cultures so that we can understand those cultures a little bit better, how they interpret their realities, how they learn to react to certain situations, and therefore how they communicate and interact with the world. Understanding that helps us to better understand how to interact with them and helps us to understand how a person is going to, or rather to predict how a person is going to perceive or react to a particular situation. So while cultural patterns, as we are learning them, seem like they're very academic, in reality, they are actually very important and useful tools in at least starting a relationship or communication with somebody who is of a different cultural background. If you know a little bit about the patterns of that particular culture, you're going to be in a better position to be able to communicate with more clarity and understand another person's communications a little bit better. So, our goal here with Chapter 6 is not only to learn about cultural patterns, but also to learn about how to apply them in a real life intercultural situation. All right, our first order of business is to try to understand perception. Perception is the process by which we interpret the stimuli in our environment. It is through this process that we determine and define reality. So, because each person's perception is individualized, each person's reality is also going to be individualized. Perception, and therefore the definition of reality, is relative to each and every individual. That perception is going to be influenced by the lessons from their culture, values, beliefs, also the experiences that we have experienced not only personally, but the experiences of the other people that have been shared to us through our culture. It is because of this individualized aspect of perception that we actually find that different individuals, will experience the same stimuli or the same experience, have the same experience, and see the same thing and hear the same things, but at the same time, then afterwards, when you ask them about what happened, they're going to have very different stories about what actually happened. So if two people have an argument and you go to each person and ask them to describe what happened or what started that argument or what happened during that argument, they both heard and saw the same things, but because they had different perceptions of what was going on, they're probably going to have very different stories as to what happened. And it's not because either one of them is lying, it's simply because of the differences in perception. Now, in that situation, we're talking about two people in an adversarial situation that have actually something to gain or lose. But even if you have two witnesses to an event. All right. You ask those two witnesses who really maybe don't have anything to do with the event, they just saw what happened. You ask them to describe what happened. More often than not, those two different people are going to have two very different stories about what actually occurred. And again, that is not because they are attempting to deceive, but because they have different perceptions. Now let's take a look at some of the characteristics of perceptions to see why perception does differ so much from one individual to the next. First of all, perception is selective. To avoid overwhelming the senses, our perception selects which information in our environment that we're going to acknowledge and what information we're going to kind of filter out as unimportant or extraneous information. We learn through the course of our lives what kinds of information are most important in what particular situations. So if we, for example, if we are out walking one day and we're looking at our phones or listening to music and not really paying attention to our environment, and we almost step out in front of a car, we're going to learn that perhaps it is more important to pay attention to what is in our immediate surroundings, especially if we're going to cross a road, than what is on our phones. I know that seems like an example that is kind of a no brainer, but at the same time, you and I both know that we have probably done, all of us, done something like that at some point or another. But our experiences teach us then what it is important to pay attention to. Is it important to listen to what a person is saying? And, does it depend on which person is doing the talking, on what type of situation we're doing? If someone is talking to us, but there's also something else going on that we want to pay attention, which one do we pay attention to? And how much attention do we give to each matter of stimuli that's going on in our environment? We learn how to do this based upon what has worked for us in the past, what hasn't worked for us in the past, and also upon the lessons from our culture. We talked earlier about how culture is a shared experiences. Part of culture is our shared experiences. Well, those shared experiences are what teach us how to apply our perceptions. They teach us what our values and beliefs ought to be, but they also teach us what is important in what particular situations in order to ensure our best chance of survivals. So perception does vary very much from individual to individual, even within a culture, because it's based upon our personal experiences, but it is also based very much upon the experiences of the people who came before us. That way, when we experience something for the first time, we're not doing it from a completely blank or clean slate. We are doing it from a place of experience, not our own experiences, but the experiences of others, and that comes from our culture. Another characteristic of perception is that perception is consistent. Once we tend to perceive something in a certain manner, we find it difficult to change that perception. Now, that's not to say that we can't possibly ever change that perception, but it usually takes some new information, a new experience, or some effort to do so. And this is the law of first impressions. If we perceive somebody for the first time or meet somebody for the first time and they say something that we find offensive, or they're not dressed in a way, or they don't present themselves in a manner that we find to be a positive manner, the chances of us being able to meet that person again and think of them positively is going to be difficult. Now, that's not to say that just because we meet someone for the first time and we don't like them the first time we meet them, that we can't ever possibly change that opinion, but it's going to take some effort on their part, some new information, maybe new experiences, maybe more than one new experience that is opposite from that first impression, and an effort to be open minded on your part in order to change that perception. So, perceptions, first impressions, tend to be lasting unless we are willing and open to try to make a change and we have additional information and experiences beyond that first impression. Perception is also often inaccurate. Because we tend to view the world through our subjective lenses based upon our personal experiences. Remember, we look at the world and experience the world through this lens of choosing which is important and what isn't important, and then applying our values, beliefs, and ethics and such to that. Because we do view the world through a subjective lens, we tend to see what we expect to see or what we want to see, and not necessarily what is going to be what somebody else sees. So what you see or what you experience, what is true to you, may be accurate in your mind according to your perceptions, but another person who experiences the same thing and sees something different, that is also accurate to them. And because two different people can experience something and have it both different, while it's both accurate to you, to each of you, it's also inaccurate in a way too, because no one person is going to see just the reality, just what happened, without any type of selective filter, without applying their values, beliefs, ethics, experiences, and stuff to whatever it is that they're seeing. Let's take a look at values, beliefs, and behaviors. I said those words a lot in the last couple of slides. Beliefs are those concepts that an individual or a group considers to be true with or without proof, meaning that a belief is the definition of belief is actually quite simple. It's simply what you believe to be true, right? What is true? Not everybody agrees on what is true. So a belief is something that is relative to the individual. Beliefs that are shared with other individuals, particularly other individuals within the same culture, tend to be self validating. Therefore, when we believe something, we look automatically for somebody else who believes to be the same thing, whether we're looking for it online or whether we're looking for it within our family units or within our cultural units, within our friend groups, whatever. We tend to group together with people who have the same or shared beliefs that we have. Because then we feel vindicated in our beliefs. We doubt our beliefs less often. So those beliefs that a person has that come from their culture, those shared beliefs, those shared experiences, tend to be more intense than beliefs that a person may have arrived at on their own as an individual. Values are shared ideas or beliefs about what is good, right, and beautiful. These values are not held personally. I mean, they are held personally, but they're generally shared beliefs because these are beliefs that tend to be more intense, tend to be more self validating rather than based upon necessarily factual things, but more just feelings of what you feel or believe to be good, right, and beautiful. So these values often come from the collective or from our culture. These values hold different levels of importance in a culture, such as primary, secondary, and tertiary values. For example, most cultures, most people will value both family and social time over, they'll both value family and they'll value career success. Um, but not all cultures are going to give each of those values the same importance. Some cultures are going to put the family and family obligations as primary importance, whereas in that situation, your career success would then perhaps be of secondary importance. So if you are approached by your boss and your boss says, like, I really need you to come on Saturday morning to do this presentation, and if you do and we get this client and you do this well, we're going to make a lot of money and you may even be in line for promotion. But say your family also has plans that day. Maybe your son or daughter has a baseball game, and you have to make a choice. Do you go to the baseball game, or do you go to work and hopefully maybe achieve some kind of career success as a result of going to work? In certain cultures, the answer would be no, this is not work time, this is family time. We're going to go to the family event. And other cultures who might have put a primary value on career success as opposed to putting the primary value on the family, which would be more of making that more of a secondary value. They're going to choose going to work and say, I'll make it up to the family later, or I'll do something to the family later, because that's still important to them. But we use the ability to give values a primary, secondary, or tertiary um, place of importance so that we can make decisions like this whenever we have to make decisions between things that are valuable to us. Values also help us to establish normal modes of behavior within a society. They teach us also how to judge the behaviors of others. So we not only learn ourselves how we are supposed to behave, what is considered quote unquote normal in our society, and what would be unusual or abnormal or weird kind of behaviors, or unacceptable kind of behaviors, and therefore how we should present ourselves when interacting with other people within our societies. But they also teach us how to judge other people's behaviors. So we look at someone wearing something that we think is out of the norm or unusual, and we might think that that is a negative thing, or we may think that's a positive thing. depending on what they're wearing. We apply our values to that particular person's behaviors and choices and communications. Our our culture is going to teach us what our values are, and our values are going to teach us how to interpret not only our behaviors or how to behave ourselves, but how to interpret other people's behaviors. Now, the next thing we talk about is behaviors. These are the outward actions that result from the application of our values and beliefs, both individually and as a group. So, behaviors are the outward results or actions that come from the application of beliefs and values. Cultural patterns are defined as generalized patterns of integrated beliefs and values that can be used to characterize a defined cultural group and thus explain both individual and collective behaviors. It is important to understand anytime we generalize, and we've talked about this before, that any individual is more than their culture. So while we can generalize about certain patterns that have been seen and experienced from one particular culture or a next over many generations, we have to remember that each person is still an individual. And just because you and I share a culture doesn't necessarily mean that all of our perceptions, our values, and beliefs are going to be the same. Our realities are not necessarily going to be the same just because we come from the same culture. That said, we are more likely than not to share many of the same values, beliefs, and perceptions because we are of the same culture than we are to share those same things with somebody who is of a very different culture. So knowing a person's or cultural patterns or the cultural patterns of that particular person's culture is going to give us a window into what may be influencing them as an individual. But you can't make that your end point. You always have to take that as a beginning step and then learn about that person as an individual beyond that. Other influences beyond just culture, such as age, gender, education, income level, and that person's individual experiences are going to influence their perceptions. Their culture is not the only influencer of perceptions. Cultural patterns are also integrated and interrelated, meaning that when we go through our cultural patterns, you're going to see that some of them sound a little bit familiar, all right? Or I won't say familiar, but similar to one another. Uh, some of them are also going to affect one another. If a culture is collective, that is also going to affect whether or not they are present or short-term oriented, what some of their values are going to be. You're going to see that as we go through cultural patterns, you can sometimes make predictions. If you know about the culture as one particular pattern, they're very likely going to be this pattern, or this pattern. Not always. Cultures will surprise you, and sometimes they tend to be very contradictory to one another. So you may expect certain patterns within the patterns, okay, because of the integration, interrelation, but sometimes cultures will surprise you. Not all cultures that are considered to be masculine cultures tend to be also be individualized cultures. Some, not all collective cultures tend to be feminine cultures. Uh, we often, we often think that these kind of patterns are interrelated, that collective cultures tend to be what we're going to call later, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we're going to call later feminine cultures. And that is true about many collective cultures, but it's not true about all collective cultures. Um, for example, the Japanese are a highly collective culture, but still very masculine oriented. What we're going to learn is masculine oriented. The United States, on the other hand, is very individualized and also masculine oriented, which is what you would expect. So cultures are sometimes what we would expect them to be and sometimes very contradictory. It's also important to realize that cultural patterns are dynamic, meaning that they're constantly changing. So the cultural patterns of our grandparents may not necessarily define the cultural patterns of today's generation. So we may look at traditional cultural patterns, and as we learn traditional cultural patterns, we have to also take that with a grain of salt. Every time we apply a traditional cultural pattern, we need to think about what generation that person is coming from and what modern trends tend to be. Because while traditional patterns are always going to be an influencer of modern trends, or even be an influencer of a person's perceptions that go beyond those modern trends, or that stay consistent despite modern trends. Um, the cultural patterns, even traditional ideologies, will change over time. Um, and we've talked about that, and we will talk about that more. So in chapter 6, we're going to be comparing cultural patterns. Our textbook, Communication Between Cultures, looks at several different methods of evaluating and tracking cultural patterns within ethnic groups. And so we're going to be taking a look at several of those different patterns, different types of tracking patterns. It isn't just using one. There isn't just one model. There's several models. It's important to understand, though, again, as while we may categorize a certain culture as adhering to a particular cultural pattern, in reality, each culture is going to contain aspects within each category of both um, both sides of that spectrum. So each culture is going to it. Well, how to explain this without actually being in front of you? Um, Try to think of a sliding scale. All right. So if we've talked about individualism and collectivism before, so let's use that as our example. So if you have a scale and you put individualism on one side and collectivism on the other, and you maybe put a line right in the middle, and so then when you're looking at a culture, you're trying to determine whether that culture is an individualistic culture or a collective culture. Now that culture will fall on either side of that scale, but they're not going to be completely individualistic, nor are they going to be completely collective. Every culture is going to share cultural traits that are both individualistic, cultural traits that are individualistic, and cultural traits that are collective. The question when looking at that culture is to say, do they trend more to the collective side, or do they trend more to the individualistic side? And that's then how we categorize that particular culture. But not all cultures that we consider to be collective are going to harbor the same degree of collectivity. Some cultures are that we would call collective are going to be more toward the middle of that scale, whereas some cultures are going to be more toward the extremity of that scale. For example, Japan is one of the most collective cultures in the world. Uh, so it's going to be more toward the end of that scale. Whereas France is considered to be a traditionally collective culture, but is probably much less so, is more likely going to be right in the closer to the middle, and possibly even because of the fact that culture is dynamic, creeping over onto the individualistic side at this point. Japan is also becoming more individualistic. Meanwhile, the United States is highly individualistic and probably the most individualistic culture in the world. So we're going to be pretty far over on that individualistic scale, but at the same time, we also do exhibit certain collective behaviors and values within our culture that aren't going to keep us completely over there. And a culture like France or like Germany, that is also a very individualistic culture, is going to maybe exhibit more collectivity than we do. So while they're still individualistic, they're more collective than we are. They're going to be closer to the middle part of that scale. So hopefully that maybe that explanation gives you a little bit of a visual as to what I mean. So when we say, okay, one culture is individualistic, or one culture is collective, or one culture is a high power distance and one is a low power distance, um, while we're labeling a culture, we have to remember that not all cultures labeled the same are equal, equally fall equally within that particular pattern. It's always a sliding scale, and every culture is going to continue or going to contain certain aspects of each side of each category. All right, so the first cultural pattern study that we're going to take a look at is Kluckhohn and Strodbeck's value orientations. Kluckhohn and Strodbeck felt that cultural patterns can be evaluated by how they answer 5 particular questions. And you see these questions here. First, 1, what is the character of human nature? 2, what is the relationship of humankind to nature? 3, what is the orientation toward time? 4, what is the value placed on activity? And 5, what is the relationship of people to each other? So first of all, let's take a look at human nature orientation. We have cultures that believe that people are inherently evil and must be strictly and constantly redirected toward good. Now, we also have cultures that believe that good and evil exist in tandem, and while evil cannot be eliminated, with education, people can become good. And then you have cultures that believe that people are inherently good, but that their culture or their environment can make them evil. Now, this should sound to you very much like the study of religion, because this particular orientation often comes directly from whatever religion tends to be more prevalent in a particular culture. So if we look at these 3 different categories and try to think about what religions might support these different types of orientations, the idea that people are inherently evil comes from, well, we see that often, I should say, in Christianity. The concept of original sin, that people have evil within them. They're originally evil, but because of the grace of God and the teachings of God, we can use that information and that constant reaffirmation to become good and to fight against our evil natures. The concept of good, that good and evil exist in tandem, and while evil cannot be eliminated with education, people can become good, is very much influenced by a lot of Eastern ideologies. Buddhism believes in uh, good and evil existing in tandem. Uh, the Confucianism is kind of Confucius believed that people are inherently good, but also put a great deal of emphasis on education. With education and with structure, you need education and structure in order to continue to be good. Or for people to be good, they need that kind of education and structure. So Confucianism kind of falls in between the good and evil human nature orientations. Uh, the Jewish people believe that people are inherently good, uh, and that their culture can, or their environment can influence them to be evil. So, again, we haven't delved into the details of religion, and you would have to know more about that. But we can see how some of the religious beliefs tend to lean toward these or support different types of orientations. The person nature or fate orientation. We have cultures who believe that human beings are subject to nature, meaning that life is beyond our control and we must learn to accept it. Now, when we talk about nature in this particular orientation, keep in mind that we're not just talking about birds and plants and that sort of thing, actual environmental nature. We're talking about we're talking about fate. We're talking about our human natures and what happens to us and how things affect us in our world. So the concept of human beings being subject to nature, we're talking about fate. That we can't control our own fates. We are driven by other forces within the world. Then there's the concept of cooperation with nature, that people should live in harmony with nature, that there is or needs to be a balance with nature, that we affect our own fates, but at the same time, our fates also control us, that it isn't just a one-sided thing. Then there's the concept of controlling nature, the idea that people should conquer and direct the forces of nature to their own advantage, from a fate perspective, meaning that you are responsible for what happens to you, or at least for how you respond to things that happen around you. And whether or not that can be a positive thing or a negative thing depends upon how you react to, or how you or what you do to affect your own fates. So when we when we try to look at different cultures and fit them into any particular orientation here, for human beings being subject to nature, a lot of cultures that are highly religious tend to be more of a human being subject to nature. Uh, the Islamic cultures tend to be fall into this orientation. The concept or the word inshallah means as God wills it. The fact that it is used very often in Islamic cultures shows that while they're not of the belief that they just sit back, do nothing, and things happen to them, but that they do believe that nothing happens without the will of God, and no matter what you do, if it is against the will of God, it isn't going to happen. So well, you need to to work to toward your own success to help things. It's really still all in the hands of God. And many highly religious people do believe that. But at the same time, if you look at the Christian religion, as we talked about in chapter 4, we also have that same added belief in the fact that people have the ability and the need to the responsibility to affect their own fates as well. So a lot of Christian related cultures tend to have a balance between this concept of fatalism, with a human being subject to nature, but also tend to lean toward, or they don't find the religious orientation to be contradictory to a controlling nature concept or orientation here. So many individualistic cultures that may be Christian based, like our own, tend to put more emphasis onto the controlling nature orientation. This idea that we are in control of our own fates, that if we fail, it is not the necessarily the will of some other force, but it is because of of our lack of trying, our lack of hard work, our lack of ability, or whatever it was that we needed to do that we did not do to attempt whatever, or to attain success at whatever we were trying to attain success at. We also apply this controlling nature idea not just to a fatalism concept, but also to actual environmental nature. If we have the ability, we would change the weather. If we have the ability, we're going to change the course of a river, or try to affect in some way, the in any way that we can, the nature around us. We will cut down a mountain to put through a tunnel if we need to get through the tunnel as opposed to going around the tunnel. We will alter our environment to 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 benefit us in the way that we feel we need to be benefited, rather than saying, well, we cannot move the mountain, we cannot go through the mountain, so we're going to have to go around the mountain, which is a more fatalistic ideology. We also have this concept of cooperation with nature, that people should live in harmony with nature. And we tend to see that concept in Asian societies where people, while they are driven and while they do feel the importance of their own contributions to their own fates, where education is high, as we've talked about, is highly encouraged and seen as a way of changing a person's fate or status within society, but they also believe that there are certain things that they cannot change, that nature and harmony are very important. So while you do have some control, you don't have full control, and that you need to find a balance between those things which are out of your control and those things which are within your control. So we see that a lot in Asian societies. We also see an emphasis on that in many Native American societies, where they feel that their their role within nature, and in this case, we're not just we're talking about fate, but we're also talking about the natural environment, is one of balance, where the natural environment is going to sustain them, but only if they if they do what they need to do in order to give back to that environment as well, that it is a give and take kind of situation. Time orientation. Some cultures are what we would call past oriented cultures, and those cultures believe that the past should be a guide for making decisions and determining truth. Meaning that when we talk about time orientation in this respect, we're talking about how cultures make decisions, what information they're going to rely on and pull from in order to make decisions. So, in a past oriented culture, they're often going to use past experiences to decide how to handle present concerns in order to affect their futures. Okay, so they're going to often make decisions based upon what has worked for them or hasn't worked for them in the past. And because of that, past oriented cultures tend to repeat the same behaviors over and over again so long as those behaviors continue to work. If it isn't fixed, don't break it, is kind of the ideology there. Present-oriented cultures put more significance on the immediate moment because they feel that the future is an unknown, so why do I need to worry about the future? I'll handle the future when it comes. And the past is in the past, right? So it's not necessarily applicable to the present. So they are going to be more concerned with dealing with the problem that is facing them right now in the way that makes the sense to them right now, that makes the most sense to them right now, or maybe the most advantageous for them right now, and think less about how I did it or how the generation before did it, and maybe less about how what this is going to do or how is it going to affect the next generation. Future-oriented cultures, on the other hand, emphasize what is to come and expect the future to always be better than the present. So a future-oriented society is going to draw from the past, but not necessarily find the past to be to dictate the way they handle concerns that they have in the present. And most of their concerns that they have in the present are going to be based upon what they think they can do to make the future better. They're always looking ahead to try and make the future different from their present and from their past. Future-oriented cultures tend to emphasize innovations, to emphasize change, whereas a past or present-oriented culture aren't going to be aren't going to be as driven by innovation and change as the future-oriented cultures will. They're going to perhaps maybe change at a slower pace. Not to say that they don't have innovation or change, but that's going to occur at a slower pace than any future-oriented society. To give some examples or to put some cultures into perspective here on each of these orientations, many Asian societies Both East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian cultures tend to be very past-oriented cultures. They often heavily religious-oriented cultures tend very highly religious cultures tend to be past-oriented cultures. Not always, though, so that's not a definite. There's you know, you can make that assumption, but you need more information before you say for sure that just because a culture is heavily religious, it's going to be past-oriented cultures. For example, like I said, maybe many East Asian cultures are past-oriented cultures and are not currently heavily religious. Their populations are not currently heavily religious, even if they may have been so in the past. But because uh, they like continuity, because they are highly collective, they tend to be more past-oriented cultures. Present-oriented cultures, we often see Latin American cultures as more present-oriented, and very much so in Africa. African cultures tend to be present-oriented cultures. In fact, we tend to see a geographic correlation here. Present-oriented cultures are often cultures that have an abundance of resources all year round. So a culture that is more subjected to change within the year, geographical change or environmental change throughout the year. Like, for example, I've got to grow and harvest in summer because in the winter nothing's going to grow. And if I don't think ahead to the future for the winter, then I'm going to die in the winter. But if you are in an African culture where the climate is fairly similar all year round, where perhaps you have resources available to you all year round, then that forethought is not as necessary. And we're thinking about that from a very primitive standpoint. But that has affected that primitive ideology of simple survival has affected the culture and the way the culture approaches even more complex decisions today. So because a particular culture may be in a situation where they have less concern about having to plan for the future for survival, that's going to affect the way they make decisions in a more complex modern society as well, as to whether or not they save for the future, or whether they would rather enjoy for today and worry about the future in the future. Again, while that's not an absolute determinative of how these people within these cultures make decisions, we do see patterns within these cultures that tend to be less future oriented or more present oriented, because they don't really have to think too far. Well, they didn't have to think too far into the future uh, years and years ago. All right, future-oriented cultures, good example of future-oriented cultures are many Western societies tend to be more future-oriented, European societies, and of course our own society as well. American culture tends to be very future-oriented. Now, if you look at American culture, you notice that geographic difference as well. The North tends to be more future-oriented than the South, which may be more past-oriented or even more present oriented. And again, we have that geographic application there, because the North has harsher winters and more of a need to think ahead for simple survival. That has affected the way people think, even in more complex, sophisticated societies today. All right, so the next orientation is activity orientation. And here we have our being-oriented cultures, our being and becoming-oriented cultures, and our doing-oriented cultures. Being-oriented cultures are cultures that encourage expression of personality, working for the moment, and indulging existing desires. These are people who tend to be present-oriented cultures. So here we see that interrelation that we were talking about earlier. So present-oriented cultures tend to be more being-oriented cultures. People who think about what they need at the present time and less about maybe what they're going to need tomorrow or what they needed yesterday. All right. Being and becoming cultures stress activities which promote more personal or spiritual development and growth. And these are, again, are going to be often cultures that are heavily religious cultures. You may see this in many Islamic cultures, but you're also going to see this in heavily influenced Hindu cultures, and even in some heavily influenced Buddhist cultures, which really we talked about in Hinduism and Buddhism, where they uh, every person is uh, almost living straddling two different realities. You've got the reality of the physical world, and then you've got Brahman, which is the ultimate reality, and that we're always striving. While we live in the physical world, we're always striving toward that ultimate reality, which is something different. So everything that we should do in our physical world should be for the purpose of trying to get closer to Brahman. So we're going to see those cultures put a great deal of emphasis on being and becoming. Doing oriented cultures often measure more accomplishments by more external or practical standards, such as how much money you make or how many material items you have. So, doing oriented cultures tend to be more uh, uh, materialistic, but they also value activity and action. They also tend to be, if we go back and look at one of the previous oriented cultures, they tend to be more humans controlling nature. So we see that interrelation as well, because it is your responsibility to make your own success. Therefore, you must constantly be doing something. And that is a very good representation of our particular culture. We tend to be very materialistic. We also value stress. We value activity and action. Inaction is or laziness is considered to be one of the worst aspects of a person's personality that we're constantly taught we should fight against. Any kind of procrastination, any kind of indulging in existing desires so that we don't have something else in the future is looked down upon. I'm not saying we don't do it, okay, because we do, but it's overall within society, we are taught that we should curb that particular behavior, and that uh, uh, and that restraining ourselves is a better behavior. But I'm actually getting ahead of myself to a different pattern. But we also put into doing oriented ideologies that we must always be doing something. Laziness is is considered to be a fatal or terrible trait to have. And so even when we are not working, we are expected to be doing something. For example, if you go on vacation or if you have a few days off from school or from work, somebody is going to ask you, most likely, they're going to ask you, whoa, you've got 2 days off. What are you doing in that time period? And even if you've got nothing planned but to sit in front of the computer or in front of your television doing nothing but just watching your butt spread, really, you're never going to say that. You're never going to say, I'm doing nothing. You're going to come up with something that you're going to be doing. And you may very well be doing it. You may, feel like, oh, I shouldn't really be just sitting here doing nothing. I shouldn't just sleep on the couch all day. I need to actually be doing something, even if it's just playing video games or something. You've got to be constantly actively doing something. And, most of us are encouraged to go out and get work done. So, how many of you, if you think about how you spend your leisure time or your off time, spend your time getting caught up on other kinds of work you have to do. So on the weekends, when you're not working for your jobs, you're cleaning the house, or you are maybe working on a secondary job, or you're reading a book, or trying to gain more education. How many of us multitask, and especially, people in this particular class are going to be multitasking, both working a job and gaining an education at the same time. So, but that's very, very common here in the United States, where we try to do as much as we possibly can in order to get as much accomplished as we can within any time period. So we are very much doing oriented, and comes from, as I believe we've talked about before, comes from our Christian teachings of doing orientation. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 4, where Christianity pushes its adherents to constantly be out there showing by example, doing something. You can't just sit and be a couch Christian, if you want to call it that. Okay, you have to be actively doing actively engaged in the spread of, or the example of, your particular religion. Now, we've taken that to a non-religious aspect and constantly feel like we need to be doing something. All right, the next is Hall's high context versus low context orientation. So this is we're done with Cluckhorn and Cluckhorn and Strodbeck's value orientations, and we're talking about another type of cultural orientation study, and that is high context versus low context. High context cultures are cultures. This actually, I should say, this type of value orientation is really important to us specifically in this class, because it focuses on how people communicate, and what how they put how they place meaning on their communications. So in a high context culture, communication does not necessarily need to be verbal. Members of high context cultures tend to employ and are very sensitive to more nonverbal communication, because high context cultures tend to be more homogenous and more collective. So the more collective, the more homogenous a particular culture is, the more likely they're going to be a high context culture. People don't have to speak as much because they simply understand one another without speech, and they understand their nonverbal behaviors, their body language a little bit more. They're more in tune with that. They're more in tune with the environment and how a person is going to react to their environment, because they have less diversity of thought within those particular cultures. They can rely on that. They don't always have to express themselves verbally, because they can express themselves non-verbally. So they tend to be more reserved in the way that they verbally express themselves. Maybe they will speak less than people of what we're going to call here, we're going to look at in a minute, low context cultures. And they will often be more indirect rather than direct in their manners of speech. So instead of saying absolutely no to something, they might say, "Oh, well, I'll think about that," when they actually mean no, and they would expect you to understand their actual meaning, maybe based upon a particular nonverbal behavior, or maybe be simply based upon the particular situation in which that is said, rather than the actual meaning of what they're actually saying, which you would assume would mean that there's a possibility. They would actually be saying that and meaning not a possibility. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on in another chapter. So low context cultures are more common in cultures with great diversity. If you've got a culture that has a lot of diversity, a lot of opinions, perceptions, experiences, different ideologies, religious ideologies, or ethnic ideologies, and cultures and co-cultures, and people are coming to a situation with many different types of perceptions, it's more difficult for you to expect that somebody is going to understand what you mean by what you say. So people of low context cultures rely much more heavily on verbal language. They tend to be more direct. If I mean no, I'm going to say no. If I mean I'll think about it, I mean I'm going to think about it. I'm going to say exactly what I mean and not something more indirect. I am not going to, it's not that people of low context cultures don't pay attention to nonverbal communication, because of course they do, and that's important. We're going to talk about that in chapter 9. But they're going to put less emphasis on that and pay more attention to what is actually being said than what is being not being said, because they're going to expect people to be direct, even if that may affect relationships. One of the reasons for high context cultures is because of concerns over relationships, which is another reason why you will see collective cultures tending to be more high context, and individualistic cultures will tend to be more low context. Um, in a low context culture, people will also put an emphasis on being heard. So they tend to speak up more often. They tend to speak their opinions more frequently because they feel as though if they are not speaking, then they are not engaged. Whereas that's not necessarily going to be true from a person from a high context culture. So if you're conversing with a person from a high context culture and they're not really contributing as much to the conversation as you think they ought to be, a lot of times a person from a low context culture will misinterpret that to mean that that person is uncomfortable or not interested, or maybe doesn't like you very much, when in reality that's just not the way they communicate. They don't feel the need to be verbally engaged in every conversation in order to be engaged in that conversation. So just because they're not saying anything doesn't mean they're not engaged. But a person of a low context culture does feel the need to be verbally engaged in order to be actively engaged in a communication. All right, the next of the cultural pattern studies that we're going to be looking at is Hofstede's value dimensions. Now, you may have heard of Hofstede's value dimensions before, because Hofstede's value dimensions are actually almost the, dare I say it, Bible of intercultural community or cultural pattern study, I should say. Uh, Hofstede's value dimensions have been around for a very long period of time, and are basically, in many cases, the basis of, or the foundation of, many other cultural pattern studies that springboard off of the Hofstede's value dimensions. So oftentimes when you talk about cultural patterns, you will be hearing about these value dimensions primarily. Now, Gert Hofstede, his original research was based upon uh, the study of 100,000 IBM employees from 50 different countries. So a lot of what Hofstede's conclusions were also skewed by professional behaviors, and not necessarily as indicative of social behaviors, even though his cultural pattern studies can be applied to social behaviors as well. And I don't know at this point if you've had the opportunity to look ahead to the rubric for your second uh, uh, essay, but your second essay is going to be just this. It's going to be applying Hofstede's value dimensions to a particular culture. Although in your second essay, I expect you to apply these not only to professional behaviors, but also to social behaviors as well. So into the non-professional arena, into the family arena as well, which is not something that Hofstede did. So we can look online to the Hofstede Center website, and on the Hofstede Center website, they're going to have a discussion of, and they keep this updated. I mean, Hofstede's value dimensions have been around for a while, but they try to keep it updated. The Hofstede Center does currently do research and expands on the research. Um, we have to remember that Hofstede even today the Hofstede Center's focus is largely on the professional environment. And so what their conclusions are not necessarily going to be the same as what your conclusions will be. So when you do your essay, and I try to explain this in the rubric, but just in case it's not coming through to you, right? I do not want you to look at the Hofstede Center's value dimensions and or their conclusions and apply them. Please do not apply the Hofstede Center's valuations to your valuations. I want to see your understanding of the cultural patterns and how you apply them, because in your conclusions may be very different because you're basing them on different aspects of that society. You're basing it on the society as a whole rather than just on the business and professionalism side of that society. And oftentimes, the values of the business and professional um, side of society may be very different from the values on the social or family side. Sometimes those values we find to be often in contrast to one another within the same culture. So again, got a little bit off topic there, but let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of Hofstede's value dimensions. First of all, we have individualism versus collectivism. And this is the one that we have already talked about quite a lot, so we're not going to get too much into it here because you should already understand this. But just to recap and summarize, we see some descriptions of individualism versus collectivism here. In individualism, the individual is the most important, and we value independence. So when making decisions, not to say that our collectives aren't important to us, but the individual needs and the individual uh, uh, successes, accomplishments are given a primary value or primary place to the needs and achievements of the collective, right? So if we have to choose between our individual success and the success of the collective, a lot of times we'll be encouraged by our society and our culture to choose the individual success over the collective good. Um, Whereas in a collective culture, the relationships and the good of the collective takes a primary value, primary place in those values. People tend to be more interdependent, and that isn't considered to be a negative thing. That is considered to be a positive thing. You should be dependent upon your collective. If you can rely on your groups, then you're in a healthy environment, in a healthy place, and you're less likely to find that you do not succeed or you do not survive within your environment. Uh, so, uh, so again, we've already talked about individualism versus collectivism before. Uh, so let's talk about uncertainty avoidance. This is the concern that a particular culture will have over the unknown nature of the future. We have high uncertainty avoidance cultures versus less or low uncertainty avoidance cultures. High uncertainty avoidance cultures try to avoid uncertainty and ambiguity through the use of strict social protocols, conformity of ideas and behavior, and resistance to change. So a high uncertainty avoidance culture is going to be less likely to take chances on things that they don't know what the outcome is going to be. They're going to be more likely to try to control behavior and control outcomes through rigid laws, rules, habits. The high uncertainty avoidance cultures, if you try to make some interconnectedness, are going to often be past-oriented cultures. They're going to look to the past and to dictate the behaviors of the present in order to minimize the unknown outcomes of the future. All right, so you see how those patterns are interrelated. These are all going to be cultures like Japan, like other East Asian cultures, where There is a right way to do things and a right time to do things and a wrong way and a wrong time to do just about everything. All right, so there's going to be a lot of conformity of behavior within the society. People are going to be expected to conform to the norms of that society, and uh, when people deviate from those norms, it's considered to be a very negative thing. So these cultures, high uncertainty avoidance cultures, also tend to be collective cultures. Um, uh, we also will see that they tend to put less emphasis on innovation. Again, put more of an emphasis on the idea if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Low uncertainty avoidance cultures, on the other hand, are less constrained by social protocol, meaning that they will have they'll. It's not to say that they won't have norms and rules. They certainly do, but those rules can be bent in a situation in which we feel or we see an advantage to that. They're not going to be as it's not going to be as important for a person to necessarily fit into the norm. Deviation is going to be more accepted so long as there are no negative consequences to that particular deviation. It's going to be something that people are going to actually encourage in certain situations in order for the chance at learning something new or trying something new or having a new outcome. Therefore, low uncertainty avoidance cultures also tend to be um, future oriented cultures. So protocols are less important than potential growth in the future or innovation. They tend to be more flexible toward deviation and more tolerant of new ideas, new people, new ways of doing things because they are less concerned with the future being different. In fact, they are actually highly concerned with making their future different from their present and their past. All right, power distance is the next of Hofstede's value dimensions. We have high power distance and low power distance. High power distance cultures teach that people are not equal and that everyone has their rightful place in a society. We find in these cultures social and organizational hierarchies are very important. Deference to a person's place within those societies are very important. Whether that is an organizational thing, like deference to a teacher or to a boss or a manager, or even within the family, deference to a parent. We're going to see that in a high power distance culture, people do not see themselves as equal with others. That's not to say that they devalue themselves, but they see each person as having different, very different and distinct roles within society, and that each role has its place within that particular societal organization, right? So each person has a place and each place has its role, whether that is a high role or a low role, or a role of the decision maker, or the role of the person who follows the decisions of the decision makers, the leaders versus the followers, the teacher versus the student, the boss versus the employee, the child versus the parent. Okay, so we see that those types of our relational identities are much more distinct. Um, in a low power distance culture, we tend to push the concept of equality. Even though we will have a hierarchical power structure as a matter of necessity, in order to get things done, somebody has to be designated to make certain decisions and perform certain roles. But we try to minimize the appearance of those inequalities, and we encourage each person to say that you may be a follower today, but you can be a leader tomorrow. And we don't necessarily we don't try to make huge distinctions between those particular roles. We have the roles, but each person has the same value and has the ability to fit any role that they wish to fit. Because of this kind of mentality, people actually in it's not just an encouragement for people in lower power positions to to be more than they are, but it is an encouragement for people who are in positions of power and the higher hierarchical positions, or the higher hierarchical positions, I should say, to try to fit in with or to minimize their appearance of superiority to those people who are in a lower position. For example, in a lower power distance culture, a manager or a boss is more likely to go on the floor with the average worker, talk to them, see what they're doing, give them a chance to be heard and give their opinions. Maybe a manager, many of you may go out with your managers, where if your place of business, they'll join you for dinner, or they'll join you for drinks or whatever, or maybe even be best friends with their and talk about non-related job topics, right? Family or hobbies or whatever. It may not be strange for you to be fishing buddies with your supervisor, whereas in a high power distance, that would be considered inappropriate. We also see this in the political behaviors. Somebody in a low power distance who is trying to a low power distance culture who is trying to gain a political office is going to try to fit in with the group that they are talking to. For example, if a politician wants to go and talk to a group of farmers, they're often going to watch what they wear. They're probably not going to wear their suits. They're most likely going to wear jeans and a t-shirt or flannel or something like that, something that they feel is going to make them look more like the people that they are talking to. And that's to their advantage, because the people that they're talking to don't want somebody who is different from them. They want somebody who can relate to them and therefore represent them. On the flip side of that, in a high power distance culture, if as a politician I am showing somebody that I am like them, then they're going to say, well, this person is like me, so I don't belong in that role, right? I am not a politician. I don't have the education, I don't have the experience, I don't have necessarily the insight that is needed for that particular job. So if they're like me, then they're not appropriate for this position either, and I'm therefore not going to give them my vote. So while people of low power distance cultures are often looking for people in power positions that are more like them, people who are in high power distance cultures are going to look to put people in power who are what they would consider to be above them in certain aspects, such as education or knowledge or societal, depending on the society that you're in, maybe a societal uh, uh, hierarchical role. All right, maybe like because they come from a certain family or they're wealthy or whatever. Um, so we do see power distance affecting a lot of aspects of society, from the basic familial behaviors to uh, your personal job, our managerial behaviors, to more of a political or national type of behaviors as well. So power distance is very pervasive in a particular culture. Now, I talked about this a little bit before, realizing that you don't understand what masculinity and femininity are yet, but this is the next of Hofstede's value dimensions. Now, you see here, he talks about masculinity versus femininity, and I have in parenthesis here career success, quality of life. Masculinity versus femininity is really a very old way of referring to career success versus quality of life. At the time, I told you Hofstede's value dimensions have been around for a very long time. At the time, career success mentality, or more of a materialistic mentality, were considered to be masculine traits, primarily masculine traits. And uh, quality of life, meaning relationship orientation and uh, uh, emphasis on happiness and contentment in life, were considered to be more of a feminine or trait. Uh, Now we don't necessarily in our modern societies accept those things as being either specifically masculine or feminine traits. So modern times you might see people refer to this particular value dimension as the career success versus quality of life value dimension. But because a lot of people do still refer to it as masculinity versus femininity, because that was Hofstede's original um, terminology, we will learn both. But please keep in mind that while we will talk about masculine versus feminine cultures, this has absolutely very little to do with gender roles. Many of my students um, make the mistake of thinking that a masculine oriented society is necessarily one in which there's a high degree of gender role differences, where men are considered more valued, or where women aren't considered equal. All right, that is not what we mean when we talk about masculinity in this particular, or a masculine culture. All right, so while gender roles, masculine cultures we'll see here, do tend to have higher, more developed gender roles, or maybe traditionally more distinct gender roles, that is a very small portion of what we consider to be an aspect of a masculine culture. All right, so please do not make the mistake, and I say this every class, and I guarantee you some of you are going to do this. Please do not make the mistake of equating, because of the language of this particular value dimension, of equating masculinity versus femininity with gender roles. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what masculinity and femininity are here. All right, so masculine cultures often, though not always, traditionally have what we call highly developed gender roles. Okay, we just talked about that. But again, that is not always the case, because there are cultures in which there are highly developed gender roles that are considered to be feminine cultures. Latin American cultures are a good example of that. They have highly developed gender roles but they are what we would consider to be a quality of life or feminine culture. African cultures tend to have highly developed gender roles, but we consider them to be quality of life or feminine oriented cultures. On the flip side, the United States tends to have less developed, highly developed gender roles, but we are a very highly masculine culture. All right, so again, that is just one possible aspect, but please do not make sure, or please do not think that that is necessarily indicative of a particular culture, whether they fit into masculinity or femininity. In fact, I would say that that's not a very reliable tool at all, or aspect of that particular kind of culture at all. But one thing that we do need to focus on when we're talking about masculinity or masculine cultures is whether they prioritize career success over other values. So a masculine culture is going to be one. We remember we used the example before when we were talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary values of the person that is approached with a choice between uh, going to the board meeting, or whatever meeting that may give them a chance to succeed in their career, versus going to the baseball game, whether to watch their child play baseball during a time that is supposed to be family time. Uh, those cultures who would choose the baseball game tend to prioritize family or quality of life over career success. Those are going to be feminine oriented cultures. Whereas a masculine culture is going to be one that is going to, more likely than not, say, sorry kid, this is really important. I got to go to this meeting. I will try to go to the next game. All right. So they're prioritizing, while their children are still important to them. I'm not suggesting they're not. They're prioritizing career success over the quality of life issue. All right. We tend to also, in a masculine culture, emphasize materialism over relationships. So, materialism, how much money we have, or how much money we have in the bank, or how big a house we own, or what kind of car we drive, is, what kind of clothes we wear. These are going to be outward expressions of our worth within society. All right. We are going to value these things and probably going to put more time, thought, and money into these types of things as opposed to those things which are actually going to maybe bring us some kind of pleasure or joy, or what we actually need in order to make our life a quality type of life. Um, we often in a masculine culture will also tolerate more assertiveness and aggression because relationships are not as important as succeeding in our environment or succeeding in our what it is we feel we need to be successful at, often our careers again. So certain types of assertiveness and aggression are going to be more tolerated, even if that is going to hurt a relationship that we may have with another person or within a particular group of people. Um, Feminine cultures, on the other hand, stress more relationship oriented types of behaviors, nurturing behaviors, not just to children, but to other members of our cultural groups, right? So we're going to be responsible for the benefit of the entire group. So there you see here we have collective traits. So feminine cultures are often, though not always, collective cultures. Um, and not all collective cultures are going to be feminine cultures. Another good example of that is Japan, a highly collective culture that is still much more masculine culture because they put a great deal of emphasis on career success. While relationships are important to them, their job relationships are going to be as much, if not more, important to them than their family relationships. All right, so lots of contradictions here. So we've talked about how we see cultural patterns. We see a lot of contradictions. Contradictory stuff happens a lot when you try to apply career success versus quality of life. In a really feminine culture, we do tend to see oftentimes in many feminine cultures that when men and women are more considered to be have more equal roles within society. So a lot of cultures in which you do find gender equality, you will see a lot of feminine traits, but then again, not always, because the United States is, you know, tends to have a focus on gender equality, or at least attempting to go that direction, but we are not becoming more feminine even as we become more gender equal. Um, but we do see that a lot in many Scandinavian cultures, where we see there is a great deal of emphasis on gender equality, but also an emphasis on the family, and on family time and on quality of life there. And that kind of fits in and encourages that concept of gender equality in those particular cultures. We, again, want to put out there that nurturing behaviors and an emphasis on relationship is not just an emphasis on that is how women should behave. When we say feminism, this is how men should behave as well. So we have an emphasis on in Islamic cultures that women should be very nurturing and put the family first, but that men do not. So in an Islamic culture, we generally are considering them to be kind of really both. Islamic culture is kind of difficult to pin down and a masculine versus a feminine culture, simply because they have aspects of both. Family and relationship is extremely important to them, both in the social arena and in the business arena. But they do also have an emphasis on materialism. They have a certain toleration of assertiveness and aggression, but there are more cultural limitations to that. And we also have highly developed gender roles. So not every culture is going to be easy to pin down into one or the other of this particular value dimension. All right, long versus short term orientation. This value dimension of Hofstede's is, in my mind, one of the hardest to understand and to apply to a particular culture. And you're going to see as you do research a lot of different attempts to understand these particular value dimension and different ways of applying this type of value dimension. It's not going to different these ways are not always going to be consistent. So the long-term orientation versus short-term orientation really is a more difficult value dimension to try to understand with any kind of continuity. But let's take a look at them. Uh, in my mind, the easiest way to try to understand long-term orientation versus short-term orientation is to understand what we looked at with Kluckhohn and Strodbeck, future versus past and present orientations. And this is while long-term versus short-term orientation for Hofstede is not exactly the same thing. I think that sometimes it's easier to think about these things in that kind of concept, and that a long-term oriented long-term oriented culture tends to be have more of those traits of a future oriented culture. They are going to have more long range goals, are going to be more pragmatic, meaning that they are going to be more restraint oriented. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. In order to save for or to achieve some type of future benefit or gain. Whether you have it for the individual or whether it's for the group, this isn't an individualistic versus collective thing. Sometimes it's being pragmatic for the purpose of the group. Okay, so this is one situation in which individualism versus collectivism really isn't applicable, one of the few situations. We tend to see in a long-term oriented society that freedom and leisure time is not as important in the present as working toward meeting future goals, meaning that a person is more likely to spend more time of their life working in order to hopefully maybe retire and spend less time working later on. So they'll work more today in order to work less tomorrow instead of finding more of a balance today and a balance tomorrow. Um, they are going to be thinking about what I can do to make tomorrow better and not thinking as much, putting much concern into what makes the quality of life better today. Short-term oriented society is going to put more emphasis on that today quality of life. So they tend to be more present oriented. Um, they are going to be more concerned about relationships and social obligations. So, and in this way, maybe you'll see a little bit of collective traits being coming into the short-term orientation. Though I would not say that all collective cultures are short-term oriented, but we will see some of those collective traits affecting short-term oriented behaviors. The fulfilling of social obligations is going to be very important because that's going to create harmony in the present, and of course harmony for the future as well. But that makes our present and our quality of life today better. We're going to put more emphasis on freedom and leisure time, on what makes us happy today, and or put more emphasis on happiness. We tend to see an emphasis on happiness in many Asian cultures. We tend to see more of an emphasis on this in maybe some Latin American cultures, which tend to be short-term oriented cultures as well. African cultures tend to be very short-term oriented. Um, again, those cultures which we would think of as being present oriented and some cultures that we think of as being very past oriented, like some of those Asian cultures that are short term oriented, um, uh, we are more past oriented. So, uh, more likely than not, we're going to see past and present oriented cultures in short term oriented category. Though again, not always. Some cultures will contradict it. You got to look at a culture as a whole to see not just a few examples of behaviors here and there, but what are their patterns of behaviors? And they may be long-term oriented in and their um, uh, professional behaviors, but short-term oriented in their familial behaviors. And so you got to find what the balance is between them when you're talking about a culture as a whole. I know that I should put out here that when you do some research and other people outside of this class, you're going to see that some people throw religion into the mix here. They tend to think of people who are more highly religious as being long-term oriented, and people who are less religious as being short-term oriented. Personally, I don't understand that approach very well. I don't think it's a very it's a I should say it's a different understanding of what the value dimensions of what this particular value dimension is than what we apply in this class. However, you could try to apply that in a way to say that uh, somebody who is highly religious tends to be more past oriented. I think I said that wrong a minute ago. People who are highly religious are said to be more short-term oriented rather than long-term oriented because they put a great deal of emphasis on tradition, on past orientation, um, and are less concerned about long-range goals. But at the same time, some certain religions put an emphasis on more of a present orientation, so that would make them short-oriented. But also, if you look at Christianity, which puts more of an emphasis on future orientation, that's not necessarily going to fit that um, that terminology. So to say that the culture is particularly religious and therefore short-term oriented, you need to look at which religion is being applied there. Um, but you will see that as some people put as an aspect of short-term orientation, very religious cultures. So you mean when you look at that and you want to apply it, you need to think about. I'm not saying don't apply it. I'm just saying think about that's not necessarily going to be an absolute determination of whether culture is short or long-term oriented. All right. So that was all of Hofstede's value dimensions, but as I said, Hofstede's value dimensions have been around for a while, so they have been added to and elaborated upon. Michael Minkoff added to Gert Hofstede's value dimensions, and he added this sixth dimension called indulgence versus industry. Indulgence stands for the tendency of a culture to allow relatively free gratification of certain human desires. And industry reflects the conviction that gratification needs to be curbed in order to fit into certain social norms or behaviors, and also to plan ahead for the needs of the collective or the needs of the individual in the future. So this is again not necessarily a individualistic versus collective thing, but more of a future orientation versus a short-term or future orientation versus a past-present orientation, or a long-term orientation versus a short-term orientation mentality. So those things are all going to be interconnected into the concept of indulgence versus industry. And whether a culture encourages indulgence versus what we call encourages industry can affect a lot of the different behaviors and values of that particular culture. Behaviors such as consumption, how much sweets do you eat, as opposed to how much how much you eat, as opposed to how much restraint you put on eating certain types of foods, like sweet types of foods, or confectionaries, as opposed to more vegetables, or how, how large the sizes of the portions are that you eat. Spending, how you spend your money, what you spend your money on, how much money you spend as opposed to how much money you save. Materialism, whether or not you need to have the biggest and the best and the brightest and the fastest and the most up to date technology at all times, or whether or not what does the job is good enough, how, whether or not we really need as much or have more than we actually need. Even smiling is a good example of how industry versus indulgence affects our everyday behaviors. Some cultures will encourage people to smile a lot as a matter of pleasantries, even to smile to people that they don't know in any particular given situation, because that is to their advantage for different reasons. For example, we here in the United States, we do tend to smile at people who are perfect strangers just because we consider that to be a pleasant social norm that will actually get us ahead in society. Uh, Whereas cultures such as Germany, who are very industrious. Okay, Germany is a very restraint-oriented culture, more so than we are. We are still considered to be an uh, probably probably middle of the road with industry versus indulgence, but maybe a little bit more on the industry side. Germany is more on the industry side than we are. They don't smile as much, and not to say that Germans aren't good-natured people, okay, and that they don't smile. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they will reserve their smiling for specific people and for specific situations. They're not just going to go around grinning at everybody for no particular reason. There's going to be a purpose behind it, or there's going to be a time and a place for it. And some cultures that tend to be more industrious, smiling is actually considered to be um, a sign of weak character. I mean, not smiling. I shouldn't say that exactly. Smiling too much. You say smiling in improper times and improper places is a concept of a weak character. Somebody who's always smiling at everybody isn't necessarily as serious and industrious as they ought to be. Meanwhile, in cultures that are more indulgence related, if somebody is too reserved in their behaviors and their smiles, okay, and how they relate to people, too introverted, they're going to be considered to be dull or uninterested, or maybe even be noted as being snobbish, or have the opinion that I'm better than you and therefore I don't want to smile at you. When in reality, that's not their beliefs, but that's the perception that people will have because of this different attitudes versus industry versus indulgence in a particular cultural pattern. So when determining whether or not a culture is an industry culture or an indulgent culture, you need to look at a lot of different aspects of that particular culture. You can't just look at one or two examples. So again, in your papers, you're going to be trying to determine whether or not your chosen culture is an industry versus an indulgence culture. You cannot give me one or two examples, because one or two examples is not really going to show us whether or not that culture is an industry versus an indulgence culture. A behavior in a social aspect may be very different than the expectations of behavior in the uh, in the professional arena. So you need to show me examples from different aspects of that particular culture, different aspects of that society, in order to understand whether a culture is truly an industry or an indulgence culture. And keep in mind that many cultures are, all cultures rather, are going to be a mix of both indulgence and industry. There is no culture in this world that is all industry, okay? That would be an extremely boring and harsh culture to be a part of. But there are cultures that are more industrious than others, like Germany, and Russia is a good example of that as well. Uh, and quite frankly, again, we see this geographical aspect coming on, whereas cultures that tend to be more northern cultures and deal with more harsh climate situations tend to be more industrious cultures, whereas cultures that are like the African cultures, the Latin American cultures, these cultures tend to be more indulgence cultures, right? Because they don't have they don't have and haven't had in their history the same challenges of having to prepare to save now to prepare for the future because the things that they needed for their daily survival were available year round. Shelter was not as big an issue and as difficult. You didn't have to worry about fighting against bitter cold and environmental situations that were as deadly and a more temperate or warmer climate than you did in the north. So we can look back to in history quite a bit to see why a particular culture may be more indulgent versus industry. All right. Minkov also came up with this idea called monumentalism versus flexibility. In monumentalist cultures, people possess and openly demonstrate pride in themselves, their achievements, their families, and their other social institutions. In a monumentalist society, people tend to express very strong and unequivocal opinions. They are not encouraged to change those opinions once they express those opinions. They will create evidences of their opinions and express great pride in their opinions so that if they change their opinion later on, it's considered to be a weakness or a backtracking. In monumentalist societies, we often see actual physical monuments to things that we consider to be good at the time. And even if later on we can find out that maybe history wasn't what we thought it was, or the effect of that particular thing wasn't what we expected it to be, it is harder for us to backtrack and say, okay, oops, yeah, I think we made a mistake. It wasn't as good as we thought it was going to be. Maybe we didn't do it quite right. Um, we're not very flexible in that. We don't like to change our opinions. We take a look at how we approach politics, okay, in a monumentalist culture, and I'll just kind of put this out there right now that the United States is a highly monumentalist culture. So you can look at ourselves with this. Whenever a politician changes their opinions on something, we we attack them pretty good about that. We don't like them to change their opinions. In fact, I remember in the 2016 election, although I dared not bring it up, but this is not falling on any political opinion. It's just, if you recall, Bernie Sanders was said to have said something about Castro and Cuba, oh God, way back in the 70s, right? And he was now saying something different in 2016. And so they actually dragged up footage of him saying that different thing back in the 70s and really kind of attacked him for that. And, really we're talking about decades in between. And yet we didn't like the fact that he changed his mind and changed his tune between one decade and another. Even though there may have been reasons for that, we still kind of did not like that inconsistency. We kind of put a thumb on that as a weakness. Um, so any time that we see any kind of change or wishy-washiness, we look at that as a weakness rather than as a strength and flexibility. A flex humility culture, on the other hand, is going to look at that very differently. They're going to say the ability to be flexible and to change our opinions on things is our strength rather than our weakness, right? To be able to say, yeah, we thought it was good yesterday, but hey, now we're seeing that things are a little bit different, so let's change our method, change our tune. Um, that's not going to show a weakness. That's going to show a strength in our behaviors and or in our characters. And in order to facilitate that, people in a flex humility society are less likely um, to show pride in a non-flexible or more permanent way. So we're not going to see as often big statues and monuments to things. While they may show pride in a particular achievement or a particular individual or a particular event, they're not necessarily going to hold as many big parades for that type of event, or they're not going to think necessarily about things that happened as much in the past and put as much emphasis on recreating those things. For example, in the East Asian world, which are very much flex humility cultures, you're not going to see a lot of rec- reenactments like we see here in the United States, where we see like reenactments of Gettysburg or reenactments of Renaissance times, or we're not going to see a lot of that in the East Asian world. We're not going to see a lot of big statues. Now, I'm not going to say there isn't any, because of course there is, right? But to historical figures. Um, we're going to see more likely, if there are statues or things like that placed, they are more likely to change when regimes change, when ideologies change. They're going to be more flexible than here, where if you put up a monument to something uh, that we thought was good at one time, and then later we change our opinions on what is good and what is appropriate, and we want to take down that monument. People have a big problem with changing those monuments or removing those monuments, simply because we have this concept of consistency being a strength. And just because we may now not see it in the same way that we saw it in the past is no way to stop our past behaviors of encouraging or showing pride in a particular thing. Uh, you see, I'm sure you can equivocate this to a lot of different things, not just in modern times, a lot of different kind of behaviors and debates and concerns about things that we've seen recently, because we see this recently, but this isn't just a recent cultural trait. That this is something that we have worked with and used to make decisions and have driven our behaviors for generations, both in our culture and in other cultures as well. All right, Minkov also has a added another dimension called exclusionism versus universalism. This is rather a newer concept, or a newer value dimension. Exclusionist cultures are more focused on membership in a group and give preference to the members of their own group, while limiting interaction with and or giving secondary consideration for those outside of their groups. Universalist cultures, on the flip side, are more likely to treat everyone similarly and place less importance on membership within a group. So we're going to see a correlation here with high power versus low power distance cultures. We're going to see a correlation versus collective versus individualistic cultures. But one of Minkov's main focuses here with exclusionism versus universalism is he's drawing a distinction between developed cultures versus underdeveloped cultures, suggesting that underdeveloped cultures tend to have more of this exclusionary, this us versus them, this smaller collective kind of mentalities than cultures that are more developed, which will tend to put more of an emphasis, not just because of individualism, but because of the uh, an emphasis on equality, and not just because they tend to be more individualistic, but because they have the ability to look toward a larger collective, that being the government, or the society as a whole, and therefore for help whenever they need it. So, for example, because a culture tends to be more developed, they are more likely to have a more developed social benefits system, whether it be a healthcare system or like a Medicaid or a Medicare type of system, or a single payer type of healthcare thing, or whether it be some kind of uh, unemployment coverage or other types of low income uh, types of social programs for people who are less advantaged. Um, those kinds of programs are more available in more highly developed societies. And because those programs exist, people are less concerned about looking toward their individual groups with an us versus them mentality, because they don't necessarily need their closer social groups in order to survive, because they can focus on the larger group, that of the nation, of the government, in order to get what they need to survive even in times that are difficult for them. But uh, in a society that is less developed, the government isn't going to be in a position to offer those types of aid for those people who need them. So their only method towards survival is to focus on the people in their smaller societies, to band together in order to ensure the survival of everybody within that smaller cultural group. And therefore, that smaller cultural group is going to be more collective, more tightly bound, and there's going to be more competition from one group to the next for whatever resources are available. So that creates a bit of a more of an us versus them type of mentality. So we tend to see that uh, like a lot of African cultures tend to be more exclusionary, where we will have many tribal types of situations and conflicts going on, even within the same overall uh, uh, national culture. The national culture takes a secondary importance to their tribal cultures. So it's more of an exclusionist kind of mentality. Whereas people in the United States, while we do put an emphasis on equality, uh, we also put we also tend to put less of an emphasis on our uh, subcultural differences than our overall culture. So we encourage all Americans to think of themselves as Americans, as part of a larger national society, despite what the differences are in your subcultures, what your religion is, or what your ethnicities are. And I know that some of you are rolling your eyes, saying that that's not what we're seeing our society going right now. But I mean, throughout our history, this has sometimes been uh, a larger has a different effect. You know, the idea of equality has been more encouraged or less encouraged, and we have all kinds of fluctuality. But generally speaking, in our society, we tend to be very accepting of diversity, and we tend to work together and look toward um, that national identity more than we look toward our subcultural identities. Most of us uh, will identify more as American than we will as Pennsylvanian or Texan or something like that. Okay. Uh, oh, excuse me. I guess I already discussed this in the last slide. I've uh, got ahead of myself. So this is basically just talking about what we already discussed. So read that. Next, we have Gelfand's tight and loose cultures. A tight culture is a culture that exhibits strong societal norms and a low level of tolerance for deviations from accepted behaviors. Uh, these are cultures that put great deal emphasis on structure, on conformity, on industrious types of behaviors, on behaviors that are more collective, better for the collective good rather than for the individual gain. They tend to put high power or emphasis on roles, not just gender roles, but organizational roles, societal roles, um, and have clearly defined rules as to what you are supposed to do and what you can do within your particular roles. Okay, so tight cultures tend to be, I'm sure with that description, some things should have popped up in your mind as some of the other cultural patterns that we've talked about. Tight cultures tend to be high power distance cultures. They tend to be high uncertainty avoidance cultures. Um, they tend to be, though not always, a more masculine type of culture. Uh, they definitely tend to be more past-oriented cultures, but can also be future-oriented as times as well. But we do see a lot of correlations here. Definitely more collective cultures. Individualistic cultures tend not to be very tight cultures. They tend to be more loose cultures. So what cultures do you think we could put into this particular category of tight? Again, our East Asian cultures tend to be more tight cultures. Our Islamic cultures are Southeast Asian or Arab cultures tend to be more tight-oriented cultures. Uh, uh, where some East European cultures will be more tight-oriented cultures. Russian culture tends to be a more tight-oriented culture as well. Loose cultures, on the other hand, have a relatively weak social norms and considerable tolerance for deviations and situational nuances. And again, we've talked about this before, where what we wouldn't term it as a loose culture, but where low uncertainty avoidance cultures they'll have norms and societal norms, but they don't mind so much people deviating from those norms in particular situations if there's a reason for it or a chance that something might be better so in the future or have a better outcome in the future. So loose cultures, while they'll have societal norms and they'll have expectations and rules, um, they they don't put as much emphasis on that. There is a time and a place and a reason for deviating from those norms, and there is a tolerance for that. So we tend to see loose cultures being more individualistic cultures, more low power distance cultures, much more diverse cultures, cultures that are more indulgent cultures in some ways. Okay, they have cultures that, or at least will have indulgent types of behaviors within them. We see this as cultures that are future oriented, uh, uh, you know, cultures that put a great deal of emphasis on uh, freedom of expression, on equal opportunity, on individualism, rather than on conformity to the norms and conformity to the collective. The next thing we're going to talk about is face and face work. Face is the self-image that you want to project to other people. Face work is the construction of that particular image. So you have a particular image that you want, a particular way that you want people to think of you or to see you as. And face work is the work that goes into creating that particular image. What am I going to do to make sure that people think of me and the way that I want, or to see me and the way that I want them to see me? Face work for our purposes, I should say, I flipped that. Face and face work for our purposes, uh, when we study communication or cultural communication, is in how people approach that within their societies. How much of an importance is face to that particular society, and whose whose responsibility it is to do that face work. And we see the differences here falling along individualistic versus collective cultures. All right. So people who are concerned with maintaining, or in it, I'm sorry, in an individualistic culture, people are concerned with maintaining their own face, right? So my my face or my self-image is my responsibility and only my responsibility. It is not anybody else's responsibility. Individuals in these cultures are defined by their own personal accomplishments. I am not defined by the accomplishments of my family members. I am defined by the accomplishments of my own family, and I am responsible for my own success, and therefore I am responsible for my own self image. My children are not responsible for my self image. My friends are not responsible for my self image. My only I am responsible for that. In a collective culture, on the other hand, self image is tied in more closely with your relationships, right? So your self image is going to be tied in with your family members' self image. So if your family members have a great achievement, that is going to affect the way that people see you. Or if they have, on the flip side, a great failure, that is going to be, that is going to affect how they see you. So uh, if they do something disgraceful, say you have a family member who commits a murder, people aren't going to look at you in the same way, even though you may have had nothing to do with that. People in collective cultures put a great deal of emphasis on values such as social pride, honor, dignity, shame, disgrace, humility, trust, respect, and prestige. Now, I'm not saying that people in individualistic cultures don't find those things valuable and don't put an emphasis on it, but they don't put the same emphasis on it, as much emphasis on it as collective cultures do. All right. So people's behaviors in collective cultures are going to be focused very much on these particular values and on preserving those values, not just for themselves individually, but for their entire group. So in a collective culture, it is not just the the responsibility of the individual to maintain your individual face work. It is the responsibility of everyone within your collective to maintain that face work. Therefore, we have what we call collective face saving techniques. We will often use indirect speech in order to maintain this collective face saving behaviors, right? So I don't want to tell you no to your face because that creates some level of shame on your part, may make you feel rejected, may make you look less than you are or feel less than you are. And therefore, I want to save you from those shameful or disgraceful feelings by indirectly saying, "Oh, I'll think about that," or "That's interesting. I'll have to put some thought into it," or "Yeah, we'll consider that." When in reality, I mean absolutely not. I have no method or intention to uh, consider that what it is you're selling or discussing, or I don't agree with you and I never will agree with you. I won't say that. I'll simply say, well, that's an interesting point of view. Let me put some thought into this, even if I have no intention of doing so, because I don't want to make you feel bad or look bad. It's uh, politeness, respect. These are extremely important tools in these particular cultures, and we will see a lot less direct confrontation in a culture that is uh, collective and putting an emphasis on this collective face work. Meanwhile, that's not to suggest that people in individualistic cultures are rude. Okay, we're not going to be an individualistic culture or a person that puts an emphasis on more individualistic face saving techniques is not necessarily going to be rude to another person purposefully in order to make them feel bad. We certainly don't want to do that. But we are going to be less concerned with the effect that our comments and behaviors are going to have on another person's self-image. We're more concerned, the greater concern is placed upon how what we say and do is going to affect our own self-image. And it's not to, again, that's not to say that we won't ever put consideration on another person's feelings or another person's self-image, but we will value clarity over preservation of another person's feelings or self-image. So if we need to directly say no to somebody, we may try and do it in as polite a way as possible, but we are definitely going to say no. Right? We're going to be direct in how we present that information so that it is not misunderstood. And again, that is not just an individualistic versus collective thing. If you recall, that is very similar to what we discussed when we were talking about high context versus low context communication types of behaviors. The globe study is not something that I'm going to go into too much. I'm just wanting to throw this out here. The globe study is talked about in your book. It's a more modern study than the original Hofstede study was. Again, it is focusing much on business and professional types of collective cultural patterns, I should say, than on necessarily more societal or social kinds of behaviors. But as you can see, there was a quite extensive study. Um, and you see the stats here. I'm not going to necessarily repeat them. But one thing that the Globe study did that was very different from many other studies that have been done is that rather than focusing on national cultural patterns, they focused more on cultural patterns across different types of societal groupings. They grouped they took 61 societies and grouped them into 10 geographical groups. So we're looking at 10 different groups upon which different societies may fit into that tend to exhibit certain types of patterns. Um, and they grouped these societies together based upon ethnic and linguistic patterns, religion, ideology, customs, historical migration patterns, historical experiences, things that kind of bound them together either ideologically or historically, and then looked at the cultural patterns of those particular geographical groups rather than studying the cultural patterns of individual national types of identities. I'm not going to go through this. I think that it's self-explanatory. You can read about it in your book. You see this table here that I have provided for you, kind of the summary that I've created for you here on the slides. And also, this is pretty self-explanatory in the book. I don't feel it's necessary for us to really discuss it in the lecture, but I do want you to read about it on your own. This is another thing that your book talks about, and these are the dominant American cultural patterns, or the dominant U.S., I should say, cultural patterns. I don't want to say American because, well, we'll get into that another time. But the dominant U.S. cultural patterns, according to Cole. Now, this is taking some of the lessons, or the patterns that we talked about before, and applying them to the American culture. And we've kind of alluded to a lot of this stuff already in our discussion. But you'll see here many of the patterns of the U.S. Society and how it relates to some of the cultural patterns, or how it relates to the American culture. I again am going to let you study this on your own. We've talked about it. I do talk about it in the lectures and in other parts of the lectures and then also in this lecture. So we will be touching on many of the things here, but I'm just going to go over it very quickly here because I do think it's largely self-explanatory and because it's a bit repetitive and some of the other things that we have discussed in the lectures. So first of all, we are a culture that puts a lot of control over our environment, or we are as I said before, a culture that believes in individual control over the environment, the ability to manipulate nature to achieve our own personal goals, the ability to direct our own fate. Okay. We put a great deal of emphasis on innovation and on change. Constant change is a positive thing. It's something that we should always be working forward to. That is, again, uh, has to do with industry. It has to do with the doing orientation, has to do with our future orientation. Time and its control. We will talk about monochronic versus polychronic time later on. But we put a great deal of emphasis on time and controlling time, and we tend to measure time. Time is very important, and this really fits into that doing orientation that we talked about before. Our individualism, a great deal of emphasis on individualism, puts us into, again, a mindset of equality versus equality or egalitarianism, where we believe that we should have social interactions that are more egalitarian. Um, uh, we put a great deal of emphasis on low power distance. As a result, Americans tend to also have very informal types of behaviors, which we talked about earlier on in chapter 5, okay, as a result of the early settlers' behaviors and the informality that came from that. But we tend to use first names with each other. We encourage maybe less formal modes of dress, particularly in the social settings, in order to promote equality. In order to promote this idea that no one person is literally necessarily better than another. We put a great deal of emphasis on individuality and privacy and individual freedom. We've talked about that again in chapter 5, that came from our history. Also on our very, uh, you know, um, our very large emphasis on individualism, which again, like I said, comes from our history, but also comes from the tenets of the Christian faith, as we talked about in chapter 4. Self-help control, the ability to achieve success based on your own efforts and merits is prized and encouraged, which is, again, a result of the high emphasis on individualism and on control over nature mentality. Competition and free enterprise, positive competition is encouraged. Uh, and also self-help control. Again, we've got this that fits into our masculinity. Our career success orientation is very important. Our emphasis on materialism, but also this fits into the again the individualism, the fact that we are a very controlling nature society. We are in control of our own fates, and again, this comes from both our history and our religious orientations as well. And again, even though many Americans come from different religious orientations, this is really even more than religious orientation. This is really driven by American history and shared cultural experiences. We put future orientation. We do not say that our past is totally unimportant. We definitely look to our past, but we do not put even close to the emphasis on our past that other cultures do. We are much more concerned with how our future is going to be. So we're always working today to make a better tomorrow. In fact, I think we often say that in our culture and use that as an encouragement for behavior to make a better tomorrow. Um, that is really important in our culture because we're highly future oriented. This action work orientation, Great emphasis is placed on the value of hard work. We will work hard today in order to save for tomorrow. That's an industrious behavior. Um, Leisure time, though, is considered to be something that should be earned. So somebody who has too much leisure time is considered to be not a productive member of society. Somebody who works hard is considered to be a productive member of society, but at the same time, we value our leisure time as well, right? But during our leisure time, we should be doing something, and that is our doing orientation showing through. Our informality again shows our emphasis on egalitarianism, uh, on uh, uh, on our informality that we've talked about before, based on the concerns that we discussed in chapter 5, or history. Um, the problem with this particular attitude toward informality and egalitarianism, while we think about that, we think that this is a wonderful thing, right? We look at that and we may even consider ourselves superior to other cultures as a result of our emphasis on informality, and on our emphasis on egalitarianism. But other cultures look at our informal behaviors, uh, and they see it as disrespect. It's like, for example, I may call my aunts and uncles by their first names, and I'm sure many of us do. Or will, maybe say Aunt Joyce, or or Uncle George, or whatever. But a lot of times we don't even bother with the title. We'll just call them by their first names. And other cultures will see us do that, and they just think that is the rudest thing. They will see us talk to our superiors in the business arena and call them by their first names. I usually, when I talk to a colleague, regardless of whether or not that colleague is in a position of organizational position above me, almost always call that person by their first name. I don't wait for permission to do so. I just do it because it's expected of me. But you definitely do not want to do that in another culture. In most other cultures, that is highly frowned upon. Where here we see it as an as a um, as a emphasis toward friendliness, or an emphasis on egalitarianism, on camaraderie. It would be seen as very disrespectful in other cultures, as a impertinent in other cultures, and rude. We tend to be direct, open, and honest in our culture. And again, those things sound like wonderful things to Americans, but our direct communication and emphasis on direct communication and on individualistic types of face saving techniques also um, tends to cause problems for us in other cultures, because we come off as being rude, because of how direct we are. But again, we're not the most direct culture. We are less direct than other cultures. Russians and Germans are more direct than we are, and often when we interact with those cultures, they can come off as being very rude to us, because they have more direct types of communicating than we do. In the same way that they can come off as being rude to us, we come off as being rude to many other cultures within the world. For these particular values, these things that we value, can actually be our undoing in other parts of the world, who don't necessarily put as much of an emphasis on these particular values. This tendency toward direct communication is also a reflection of the value of time within our culture. So that fits into this as well. We put an emphasis on direct kinds of communication because we don't want to be misunderstood. We want to save time by making sure that we're completely understood, and that way things get done more quickly than when there's more ambiguity in the situation. We put an emphasis on practicality and efficiency. We put an emphasis on concerns like budget and time, and other in, other concerns whenever we're making a decision, whether or not we have the money to do it, whether or not we have the time to do it, how that's going to affect us in the future, either financially or whatever. more than how it's going to make us feel right now. Okay, um, whether or not we we owe somebody something. You know, if we, for example, uh, we will see when we talk about things like mutual obligation, uh, we will when we're choosing who to choose or choosing who we're going to choose for a particular job or how we're going to do something, uh, if one way of doing something benefits a friend of ours, that is going to be less of a consideration than if doing it a different way is going to be cheaper for us. For example, I've got a cousin. I don't, but I'm just saying, I've got a cousin that is a plumber, all right? And I know he's kind of down on his luck and he could use a job right now, and I've got a plumbing job that needs to be done. But my cousin is a little pricey, all right? And kind of lazy. All right? He doesn't do the job as well as I think he ought to do. And I hear that this other person who I don't know is really efficient, really good at what he does, and is going to probably charge me less. Who do I choose? Do I choose my cousin or do I choose the other person? Uh, Americans tend to put an approach on or put more emphasis on those practical considerations than on the mutual obligation. So I'm more likely, most Americans are more likely to choose the person you don't know who's going to do a better job for less money, as opposed to choosing the cousin and pay the cousin more for a lesser job. Now that it is influenced by age and other cultural influences. Different people from different subcultures may approach that differently and make different choices. Like I may, people who are older, of the older generation, tend to feel more, have more collective behaviors and lessons than people of the more modern generation. So they may be more likely to choose somebody who they know but through social obligation or through familial obligations or even through organizational obligations. A lot of older guys belong to, and I'm sorry if any of you young guys do too. I don't mean to suggest that younger men are interested in these sort of things, but tend to be in groups called like the Shriners clubs and the Lions groups and these charitable societal socialization or social organizations, the Masons and such, and they will feel an obligation. Many of them will feel an obligation to choose somebody who is within their organization for things like plumbing or electricity or whatever they need to do, and give them the work over somebody who is not a member of their organization. We don't see that as much in the younger generations here in the United States. We tend to see it more in the older generations. uh, we do feel that materialism and the ability to achieve material success or wealth is the right of every American, and that's significant. Okay, it's not just that you can do it or this is a positive thing to try to try to achieve, but that this is the right of every American citizen to be able to to acquire whatever it is you want to acquire, or achieve whatever it is you want to achieve if you work hard enough for it. So if we have a situation, or we find a situation in which somebody has worked hard and done their best, and they're not seeing the material results or the even the immaterial successes that we feel that they ought to be in accordance with their efforts, we consider that to be a societal failing, and uh, we're probably going to start some kind of movement to correct that societal failing. All right, so we've pretty thoroughly discussed the different types of cultural patterns, and talked about how to apply them somewhat. I told you that we were going to be in this chapter learning not just the academic concepts of these particular cultural patterns, but also learning how to apply them. And that is the purpose of your Chapter 6 activity. So you're going to be seeing this week that you have a Chapter 6 activity assigned. And in that activity, you're going to be given several different scenarios that you will need to apply cultural patterns to. And through the application of the cultural patterns to those scenarios, I want you to see how, if you were to find yourself in these very common types of situations, how you can use the knowledge of cultural patterns. Say, I know that the Asian culture tends to perceive things and have these particular types of values, and that's how and how these particular types of values are going to affect their perception and their communications and their behaviors. And therefore, I can understand why a person is doing something that they're doing, or why they may be saying something that they're saying, and be able to understand it with more clarity, and also to predict what they're going to think about my particular types of behaviors, and therefore maybe change my behavior to be more accepting to or acceptable to them, or at least more understandable to them, so that they are perceiving me in the way that I wish to be perceived. So cultural patterns, knowing these cultural patterns, being able to predict and understand how they affect a person's behaviors and communications is really, really important to intercultural communication. And the Chapter 6 activity should really bring that home for you. So uh, get started if you haven't done it already. Get started on that Chapter 6 activity. And if you have any questions, you know how to ask them. All right. Thank you. And we'll talk to you again in Chapter 7.